On the night before Thanksgiving in 1971, America was already settling into a familiar holiday rhythm of airports, short flights, and strangers passing each other without a second glance. Northwest Orient Flight 305 had left Portland for Seattle on what should have been a routine trip. It was the kind of flight no one expected to remember. And that was exactly what made the man in seat 18C so dangerous. He did not look like panic. He did not sound like chaos. He looked like another businessman in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase, ordering a drink, and waiting with the kind of patience that rarely seems important until it's too late. Then he handed a note to a flight attendant. Inside was a threat, a bomb, and a demand that would turn one of the most ordinary flights in the American Northwest into one of the country's most enduring mysteries. By the time the plane reached Seattle, he had demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. The passengers would be released. The crew would not. And a few hours later, somewhere in the dark sky between Seattle and Reno, he stepped out of the rear stairs of a Boeing 727 and disappeared into the night with a ransom strapped to his body. No body was found. No definitive identity was ever proven. Decades of investigation followed. And even after one of the longest manhunts in FBI history, the man who called himself Dan Cooper remained exactly what he became the moment he jumped. Not just a criminal, not just a suspect, but a hole in the American story that never fully closed. For more than 50 years, the story of D.B. Cooper has usually been told as if the mystery begins and ends with one simple question. Who was he? But that is only the most obvious layer of the case. The deeper question is far more unsettling. How did a man board an ordinary commercial flight, carry out one of the boldest hijackings in American history, jump into the night with ransom money, and leave behind a case that still refuses to settle into a clean answer? Because this is not just a story about a hijacker. It is a story about the gap between what should have happened and what apparently did happen. A man who looked unremarkable became unforgettable. A crime that should have ended in a body, an arrest, or a hard conclusion instead dissolved into fragments. A tie left behind. Parachutes chosen under pressure. Ransom money that partly resurfaced years later. And a trail that somehow never became a destination. The more closely you look, the less this case feels like a solved event waiting for a name. And the more it feels like a rupture in the record itself. So this is not just a retelling of the hijacking. This is an attempt to pull apart the structure of the mystery. To go back to the world before the jump. To the assumptions people made about air travel, risk, and control. To reconstruct the break itself. And then to move into the details that never fully fit. The contradictions. The missing certainties, the theories that sound persuasive, and the reason this case survived not only as an investigation, but as an American legend. Because to understand D.B. Cooper, we do not just have to ask who he was. We have to ask why his disappearance still feels bigger than the man who vanished. To understand why the Cooper case still feels so strange, you have to go back to the America that existed before the jump, not the America that remembers D.B. Cooper as a legend, the America in which he was still just a man buying a ticket with cash at an airline counter. In November 1971, commercial air travel was already a major part of American life, but it did not yet carry the hardened security culture people now instinctively associate with airports. The country had already been dealing with hijackings throughout the 1960s. Aviation security was becoming a serious concern. But the system was still far from the rigid, heavily screened environment that later generations would think of as normal. That gap matters. Because Cooper did not break into a fortress. He walked into a system that still assumed normal-looking passengers were probably exactly what they appear to be. And that is what made the beginning of this story so deceptively ordinary. On the afternoon of November 24th, the day before Thanksgiving, a man using the name Dan Cooper walked up to the Northwest Orient counter in Portland, Oregon, paid cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle, and boarded Flight 305. He was not loud. He was not frantic. He was not theatrical. He was described as middle-aged, wearing a business suit and raincoat, with the kind of appearance that disappeared easily into airport traffic. He sat down. He ordered a drink. And for a few moments, even the flight attendant who received his note assumed he might simply be another passenger trying to flirt. The mystery would later become enormous, but at the beginning, its greatest power was camouflage. The aircraft itself mattered more than people realized. Flight 305 was operated on a Boeing 727. That plane would become inseparable from the case because of one feature in particular, the rear air stair. That feature would shape not only the hijacking, but the entire mythology around it. The 727 allowed a person to lower the aft stairs in flight under certain conditions. That gave Cooper a disappearing door that did not exist in the same way on many other commercial aircraft. This was not just a technical detail. It was one of the structural reasons the case could become what it became. A mystery is rarely built from personality alone. Often, it depends on an opening in the system. And in this case, the opening was literal. There was also another layer beneath the calm surface. This was an America in which institutions still projected authority, but public trust was starting to fray. The country had not yet passed through Watergate's full collapse of confidence, but the broader mood was already shifting. People still believed in systems. They still believed in airlines, federal agencies, and the visible machinery of order. Yet the edges of that confidence were becoming thinner. That matters because the Cooper case would later thrive in exactly that fragile space, between institutional control and the suspicion that control was never as total as it looked. The story endured not only because a man vanished. It endured because he seemed to expose a weakness in a system that was supposed to know where people went, what they carried, and how a crime like this should end. At first, though, none of that was visible. At first, there was only a short flight between Portland and Seattle, a businessman with a briefcase, and a country that still believed routine was a form of protection. That is what makes this case so powerful in retrospect. Before it became a mystery, it looked like an ordinary American afternoon, and under that appearance of order was a crack that would open the entire story. The break did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, and that is part of what gave the hijacking its unnerving precision. Not long after takeoff, the man in seat 18C handed a folded note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. At first, she did not rush to open it. A man traveling alone in a suit, passing a note to a flight attendant, did not automatically look like the beginning of a national mystery. But when she finally read it, the tone changed instantly. He claimed he had a bomb. He told her to sit beside him. Then he partially opened his briefcase and showed her what appeared to be red cylinders attached to wires and a battery. From that moment forward, the flight was no longer routine. It was being managed by a man who did not need to shout to control the room. He gave demands with a kind of measured clarity that made the situation more disturbing, not less. He wanted $200,000 in cash. He wanted 4 parachutes. And he wanted a fuel truck ready when the plane landed in Seattle. The amount itself was large enough to make the crime serious, but it was not so extreme that it sounded irrational. The parachutes introduced something darker. He was not only planning to negotiate, he was planning for movement after the money was delivered. What followed was not a chaotic hostage drama in the usual cinematic sense. It was slower than that, colder than that, and in some ways more difficult to process. The pilots were informed. Authorities on the ground were alerted. The plane remained in the air longer, while the demands were assembled in Seattle. On board, Cooper stayed composed. He drank bourbon and soda. He spoke with control. He seemed to understand enough about the aircraft to make requests that were unusually specific. Witnesses would later remember not a wild-eyed fanatic. They remembered a man who acted like he had already accepted the risk and moved beyond panic. When Flight 305 finally landed in Seattle, the exchange went forward. The ransom money was delivered, so were the parachutes. Then came the first moment when the event could have ended in a way the public would later recognize as normal. It did not. Cooper released the passengers. He also released some crew, but he kept key flight personnel on board. And that decision pushed the case out of the category of contained hijacking and into something much stranger. This was no longer only about escape from the ground. It was about what he intended to do once the plane was back in the air. He gave new instructions. The aircraft was to take off again, heading generally south toward Mexico, with low altitude, lowered speed, and a configuration that matched his apparent plan. Somewhere after leaving Seattle, as the plane moved into darkness over the Pacific Northwest, he sent one of the attendants into the cockpit and remained alone in the cabin. At some point later, the crew noticed a warning indicator showing that the aft staircase had been deployed. The plane experienced a change in pressure and motion consistent with activity at the rear. That was the moment the story broke away from ordinary criminal logic, because from there, the official outline becomes both simple and almost unbelievable. A man carrying ransom money, wearing a business suit and loafers, on a stormy November night, somewhere over rough country, lowered the rear stairs of Boeing's 727 and jumped into the dark. No one on board saw the jump itself. No one on the ground watched him land. There was no clean capture point, no immediate body, no final image of impact, surrender, or escape. The system knew the crime had happened. It knew roughly where the break had occurred. But the instant that should have produced certainty produced only absence. And once the rear stairs opened over the night sky, the case stopped being just a hijacking. It became a disappearance. At first glance, the Cooper case looks like the kind of mystery that survives simply because one man got lucky. But the deeper reason has never settled is that too many parts of the story resist a clean fit. The official outline is easy enough to repeat. A hijacker boards a plane, extorts money, jumps into night, and vanishes. But once you move past that outline, the case begins to fracture into details that are harder to reconcile with each other. The first problem is the jump itself. Over time, D.B. Cooper became almost mythic in the American imagination, as if he were some kind of elite airborne ghost who understood exactly what he was doing. But the evidence has never sat comfortably inside that legend. He demanded parachutes, which suggests preparation. He issued specific flight instructions, which suggests forethought. Yet some of his choices have also been read as the choices of a man whose knowledge may have been incomplete or uneven. Investigators and later analysts have long debated whether he was truly an experienced parachutist or someone who understood just enough to attempt something extremely dangerous. That matters because the entire legend of Cooper changes depending on which version is true. If he was highly skilled, the jump looks like a calculated disappearance. If he was not, the story starts to look less like a perfect escape and more like a gamble that should have gone terribly wrong. The second problem is physical survival. The conditions at night were brutal enough to make the disappearance feel almost impossible. It was dark. It was cold. The terrain below was harsh. He was not dressed for wilderness survival. He was carrying a heavy ransom bag. And he was jumping from a commercial aircraft into a space no one could fully observe. This is one of the central tensions that keeps the case alive. The event is famous because he vanished. But many of the same facts that make the vanishing impressive also make it seem deeply implausible. The mystery lives in that contradiction. The case never produced the kind of closure that should follow a failed jump, but neither did it produce the kind of evidence that would confidently prove a successful one. The third problem is the money. Years later, a young boy named Brian Ingram found a portion of the ransom along the Columbia River at Tenabar, and the serial numbers matched Cooper's money. That discovery should have narrowed the story. Instead, it made the geography and the timeline more confusing. The money had not surfaced with a body. It had not led cleanly to a route, a camp, or an identity. It reintroduced the case to the public, but not in a way that solved anything. It was as if the mystery had given back just enough to prove it was real, while still withholding the one thing everyone actually wanted, a coherent ending. The fourth problem is the suspect trail. Over the decades, names have come and gone. Each one briefly promised a face behind a composite sketch. Some suspects sounded plausible because of military backgrounds, parachute experience, or circumstantial links. Others gained attention because they fit the atmosphere of the story more than evidence. But the case has outlived every neat suspect narrative placed on top of it. That is one reason the legend keeps regenerating. Each time the public thinks the mystery might narrow into a person, it slips back into ambiguity. The identity question remains open not because nobody ever tried to answer it. It remains open because none of the answers could fully bear the weight of the story. And maybe that is the detail that matters most. The Cooper case does not survive because there are no clues. It survives because the clues do not pull in one clean direction. They point toward competence, but not certainty, toward survival, but not proof, toward death, but not closure, toward identity, but never enough identity to end the myth. And that is the moment where an unsolved crime becomes something else. It becomes a story that keeps feeding on the space between evidence and imagination. The most durable explanation is also the least romantic one. D.B. Cooper did not survive the jump. For many investigators and aviation experts, this has always been the baseline logic. The conditions were harsh. The terrain was unforgiving. The weather was poor. And Cooper was wearing clothing that did not suggest a man prepared for a deep wilderness landing and escape. On top of that, the choice of parachute and the mechanics of the jump have long been used to argue that whatever knowledge he had, it may not have been enough to make this a controlled exit with a reliable plan for survival. From this angle, the case remains unsolved not because he pulled off a flawless disappearance. It remains unsolved because nature and geography erased the final proof. No body was recovered, no gear was cleanly traced, and the Pacific Northwest kept the ending to itself. That explanation is powerful precisely because it requires no superhuman escape. It only requires one desperate man, one reckless leap, and a landscape large enough to swallow the evidence. And yet that explanation has never fully satisfied the public imagination, because other details keep pulling the story in the opposite direction. Cooper did not behave like a man improvising under panic. He appeared calm, deliberate, specific. He asked for 4 parachutes, not 1, which may have been a tactical choice to discourage authorities from sabotaging his gear. He issued flight instructions that suggested at least some familiarity with aircraft performance and the 727's operating possibilities. From that angle, the jump does not look like blind desperation. It looks like a plan built by someone who had studied just enough of the system to turn a commercial airplane into an exit route. This is the explanation that sustains the classic Cooper legend. Not a doomed hijacker, a disciplined operator who understood risk, accepted it, and disappeared before the state could close the gap. It is not hard to see why this version endured. It gives America a vanishing outlaw who feels less like an accident and more like a deliberate breach in the machinery of control. But the problem is that both of those explanations carry real weaknesses. The survival theory is compelling because of Cooper's composure. Yet composure is not proof of capability. A person can sound prepared and still make fatal decisions. The death theory is compelling because of conditions. Yet impossible conditions do not always produce immediate closure, especially across remote terrain and fragmented search zones. This is what keeps the case alive. Each major explanation looks persuasive until you push it one step further. Then the certainty begins to thin out. The more carefully you balance the evidence, the less the mystery feels like a puzzle with one missing piece. And the more it feels like overlapping partial truths that never lock into place. That brings us to the suspect theories, which occupy a different layer of the case. Over the years, multiple men have been advanced as possible Cooper candidates, often because they had military histories, parachute training, regional ties, or biographies dramatic enough to fit the myth. Some names generated enormous public excitement, but again and again, the same pattern repeated itself. The suspect would seem strong at the level of atmosphere, anecdote, or partial coincidence, then weaken under forensic scrutiny or documentary gaps. The case attracts identities the way a magnet attracts filings. The myth is so strong that people keep trying to force a face onto it. But the stronger the myth becomes, the harder it is for any single suspect to carry it convincingly. Then there's the most dangerous category of explanation, the inflated theory, the internet-ready version, the one that turns uncertainty into spectacle. This is where Cooper becomes not just competent, but almost mythically perfect. In these versions, every ambiguity becomes evidence of mastery, every missing piece becomes proof of a grand design, and every investigative limitation becomes a hidden endorsement of the escape. These theories are attractive because they are emotionally clean. They turn a complicated case into a stylish legend. but they also flatten the very thing that makes the mystery worth examining. The Cooper case is powerful not because it proves the existence of a criminal genius. It is powerful because it never fully lets us decide whether we're looking at brilliance, luck, failure, or a mixture of all three. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. So, if we map the explanations honestly, the picture looks like this. The most rational conclusion may be that Cooper died in the jump or shortly after it. The most enduring legend is that he survived and vanished into America. And the most marketable versions are usually the least reliable. The reason the case still breathes after half a century is that no explanation fully crushes the others. Each one answers part of the mystery while leaving another part exposed. That is why the argument never ends. Not because the case has no facts, but because the facts refuse to line up behind a single satisfying ending. What makes the Cooper case endure is not just that a man disappeared. America has seen disappearances before. What gives this one its strange power is that it sits at the intersection of crime, performance, and institutional failure. The case reveals how quickly a real event can become larger than its evidence when it exposes a weakness people did not want to see. In 1971, the hijacking happened inside a commercial air travel system that still looked modern, organized, and in control. But Cooper showed that the system could still be entered, manipulated, and exited by one calm man with a note, a briefcase, and a basic understanding of pressure points. That is part of why the case never remained just a criminal file. It became a story about the limits of visible order. It also reveals something uncomfortable about public memory. People do not preserve every unsolved case equally. Some vanish into archives. Others harden into folklore. Cooper survived in the American imagination because he arrived in exactly the right form. Self-possessed, sharply dressed, and unresolved. He fit the visual language of a modern outlaw without leaving behind the kind of blood, confession, or ideological manifesto that would make him easier to contain. The absence of a body did not just preserve uncertainty. It preserved style. And once style attaches itself to mystery, the public begins to remember the silhouette more than the violence of the act itself. That is why the case was able to drift, over time, from hijacking into legend. There is another layer, too. The Cooper story reveals how human beings respond to gaps in the record. When evidence runs out, imagination does not stop. It organizes itself. It starts building versions that feel emotionally complete even when they are factually fragile. Some people want Cooper to be a criminal genius because that ending is elegant. Others want him to have died in the wilderness because that ending restores moral gravity. Both impulses are understandable. Both try to close the same wound. But the case resists closure because its real shape is neither mythic nor neat. It is a reminder that systems can fail without collapsing, that evidence can survive without resolving, and that a story can stay alive for generations simply because it never gives the public the one thing it wants most, a final image that settles the argument. In that sense, D.B. Cooper is not just a mystery about one man. He is a mystery about what a nation does with absence, about how authority responds when it cannot fully explain itself, about how media, memory, and myth can turn a rupture in a record into something that feels almost designed to endure. The real power of the story was never only in the jump. It was in the hole the jump left behind. Somewhere in the American imagination, that staircase is still hanging open. The rain is still falling over the Pacific Northwest. The engines are still pushing through the dark. And a man who called himself Dan Cooper is still standing at the edge between history and legend, holding a bag of cash, one step away from becoming either a dead hijacker, a vanished fugitive, or something even more enduring than both. That is why this case never really ends. Not because there are no facts, not because people stopped looking, but because the final image was never given back. No arrest, no confession, no body placed cleanly at the end of the file. Just a break in the record, and the long shadow that break left behind. Maybe D.B. Cooper died the moment he jumped. Maybe he survived just long enough to disappear into the country he had just outplayed. Or maybe the real reason this story survived is simpler than either theory. America has never been able to resist a mystery that looks like freedom, danger, and absence all at once. And that is what D.B. Cooper became. Not just a man, not just a crime, but a missing ending that refused to stay buried. If there's another file you want to open, another mystery that feels too strange to sit quietly inside the official story, leave it in the comments. And if you are drawn to stories where the truth does not disappear, but only gets harder to hold, subscribe to Black File Society.